So why do I have all these cameras here? I was realizing when I was talking about in the last video I posted around the Konica SLR that I was given to my cousin, just basically the simplicity of these old SLRs and as far as, exposure. And I feel like people have sort of lost that, with these DSLRs and auto modes, which aren't necessarily a bad thing, but they've kind of forgotten the sort of fundamentals and just not really even fundamentals, but just sort of the basics of exposure, specifically, your aperture and your shutter speed. Obviously, you have your ISO, but that's more of a fixed situation on if you're shooting film. And then, with digitals, obviously you have the ability to do auto ISO, but you could surely enough just shoot in a specific ISO setting and it would be the same. And this is just kind of a, just some of the cameras I have, and, a couple are film, these two over here, a couple are digital. And what kind of the focus here is why I like Fuji X-Series cameras, and these are a couple of them, for instance. So here's an old Konica FC1. It's an old 35mm SLR, and you'll see, sort of the basics I'm talking about and this actually has an auto mode, I'll point out. So these Konicas only had auto exposure as far as aperture, so basically the camera had the ability to auto set aperture. So this would be the equivalent to, say, shutter priority, what someone with the DSLR would call it. You would just purely select, well, obviously you have to pick your ISO, or in this case, ASA, they used to call it. And then you pick your shutter speed, and depending on what the camera thinks with the light meter, it will tell you in the viewfinder what aperture it's going to shoot at, and what aperture it believes is the proper exposure. You obviously can override that and pick your own aperture, but it will allow you to auto set it. But when you're shooting manual, it's just easy enough where you basically, it tells you, for the situation, you need f8, and you could surely enough just kind of add a little bit more light with one stop, or, in the case where you're backlit, and that's kind of playing into the exposure, you need to kind of expose more, and, maybe with today you'd use something like a, exposure compensation, but you could easily dial in, say with exposure comp dial, you end up going one stop more light. Well, if you're shooting f8, you just simply need to go to 5.6 for one stop. Or if you had dialed in, two stops, which is the max on the X100S, you can do two stops just as easily by going from, say, we're at f8 to f4. That's two stops more light, because your shutter speed, again, is fixed. I get that with these cameras, if you had it in both, if you had it basically in program mode with both the aperture set over here to auto, and you had the shutter speed set to auto, that's like program mode. Obviously the exposure comp has the ability to adjust both of those values, your shutter speed and your aperture, to get in that case, the scenario of two stops more light or two stops more exposure. But just as well you could do it with this camera. You could say you don't want to go all the way to f4. Well, if you just go from f8 to 5.6 and you still need one more stop of light, just as well you'd go to 1/25 from 2/50th, and that's one more stop there. So f8 and 2/50th, you need two more stops of light. You can go one stop, or you could just go two stops, or you could go two stops this way. And it's so basic. And I feel like with these modern DSLRs, specifically with just these command dials, he's kind of gone away from this kind of intuitive stops connection. And this is just one camera, for instance. This is a Konica SLR, but I'm going to set this aside over here and pull over a Nikon, which is a sweet camera, by the way, I picked up recently. I have another video about it. This is a FM3A, and just in case you're curious, I'm shooting a Nikkor 50mm 1.8. This is one of the last of the 51.8s that some people call a pancake. It's not really a pancake, but it's pretty small, and it's a nice lens. Anyway, same idea here. Nikon's interesting, as you remember I just mentioned how this Konica had the ability to do basically what people called it a shutter priority, because it was auto picking the aperture, but you still had to pick the shutter speed. This implementation on the Nikon was the reverse. You always have to pick aperture, so you can be in a what we would call manual mode today, where you're picking shutter and your aperture, but Nikon allows you to put it into aperture priority, where it's doing auto shutter speed, and you just pick your aperture. But, you know, just like the other camera, it's the same old deal, where you have your ISO setting based off whatever you're shooting. You know, I'm shooting a Provia 100F, in case you're curious, which is 100 ISO. You pick your shutter speed and your aperture, and you'll figure out your exposure. If you, again, need to do exposure compensation, this is why I bring up this camera, because it's modern enough that you actually have the ability to push this button and rotate this dial, and it did have exposure comp. Again, it would either have the ability to do that, I mean, it really only has the ability to do that with the aperture priority, but by doing the exposure comp, I think it will actually show you what it believes the correct exposure is with that compensation in the viewfinder. I don't really use it, but again, you know, you still have that simplicity of, if you're at 1/25 at 2.8 and you want to dial in one more stop, you could go this way and go from 2.8, you know, to f2 or f1.8. I think there's a stop right here for f2 and then 1.8. But you know, you have those single stop increments. You can't, it's not labeled here, but f2 is right there, and then this is 1.8. You would just simply move. So 1/25, 2.8, you want one more stop, you can go that way, or you can go one more stop this way, more light. If you wanted to underexpose by one stop, you could go this way, or you could go this way. And again, it's super intuitive. Or two stops, you'd go in both directions, cutting light. So, you know, it's super intuitive. Set these both aside now and talk about these Fujis, and this is why, again, I like these Fuji X-Series cameras. Here's X100S. It's not a new camera. They have replaced it actually with the X100T at this point, but it's basically the exact same layout. There is one interesting difference that I'm going to point out. People actually called it an upgrade when they switched to, I think it's now has third stop increments, sort of like this 56mm lens on the XT1 over there I'll show. But what I actually really liked about this X100S, and I think the X100 was the exact same way, is you still have just single stops. So you have, and remember I mentioned f2, even though it's not labeled on this lens, that is one stop less than 2.8 obviously. You have single stop movements and single stop movements with your shutter speed and your aperture. So again, that scenario, 2.8, I think I was mentioning at 1/125th. If you want to add one stop more light, you go to f2, or if you want to keep 2.8 for the slightly more depth of field, but you still need to add one more stop, you'd go down to 60th of a second from 1/125th. If you wanted to cut light, you'd go to, you know, faster shutter speed. And if you want to cut light, you could also go to a smaller aperture like f4, f5.6. But it's super intuitive, so, you know, if you're basically looking at through the viewfinder and you know you have your exposure, but you're like, oh man, I want to have a deeper depth of field, you could quickly just pop yourself over to f11, and that's cut 2 stops of light. So you'd need to add 2 stops of light and go to 60th. And sure enough, you could do that. Obviously, this camera is modern, it's digital. You have the ability to have auto ISO in the camera set up, and you could just have it do that for you. So you could, you know, just go into your Q menu, and I actually always have auto ISO on in this camera because it's just easier that way. And you'd have no issue at all. But if you're not shooting an auto ISO, or you still want to just, you know, control it more, you have the ability to adjust the exposure yourself. And I think, again, it's lacking with a lot of these digital SLRs that you don't have these functions. People made fun of that Nikon DF, and honestly think it's really overpriced for what it is, but I've never used one, so I'm not going to give it a hard time. And supposedly it's nice for using these old lenses. I have no idea. I've never used a DF. It's sort of too expensive in my opinion. But it's like the cost of... The DF costs more than like all of this right here. So it's kind of overpriced. In either case, it does have some of those manual dials. You won't have an aperture ring unless you have an old like AIS lens like this, or even some of the later AIS lenses in the 80s and stuff. But you'd have your shutter speed dials. So that's like the one DSLR I'm aware of that has those manual dials instead of just the standard command dials that look sort of like this. You know, again, I'm getting repetitive here, but here's the Fuji X-T1. And you know, this one's actually even nicer because not only do you have your ability to do direct shutter speed here with the single stop increments, and you could do your aperture. And in this case, they on these lenses for the X-Series interchangeable cameras like the X-T1 and the XE2 and the X Pro 1, They actually do the third stops, so you have 2 spots in between each stop. So if you don't want to go one full stop from 2.8 to 2, you can just go down a little bit, and then obviously adjust your aperture as needed. You do have the ability to fine-tune your aperture with the command dial, so if I'm set here, and I'm going to change the display so you can see this, if I'm set to 1/125th, but I don't want to go all the way to a 60th or 1/250th, you can rotate this back command dial for third stop increments of shutter speed as well. You can go either way. So they do give you that option, but it's quicker just to simply do it here. And this camera, I do often actually shoot in specific apertures because they have the dial on top and it's so easy to quickly set it versus needing to dive into a menu. So again, you have that ability to quickly make exposure adjustments, and it's intuitive, and you can kind of do it by feel. And you don't really have that with these newer cameras. So I think it's something maybe people haven't thought about, or maybe people don't really, they know about it and they deal with it and they just haven't put it into words. But or maybe that's why people like the dials, but it really does actually make shooting more intuitive and more straightforward, which is where these cameras used to be. So I think it's a really key feature of these X-Series cameras, and it's consistent between the interchangeable ones and the kind of high-end point and shoots like this that they want to call it, where you can't take the lens off. They have the same style controls that is very analogous to these old film SLRs that I'm loving, and people use for many years, and now everyone somehow became crippled because they all have auto modes and they don't know what an exposure is, and they just let the camera do it for them. And it's kind of disappointing. And even if you don't want to do the aperture or your shutter speed, even with these cameras, you can do what I was calling program mode, which you're probably aware of, where you just set your aperture to auto, shutter speed to auto, and it's basically going to do everything for you. Especially if you have your ISO and auto as well, the camera's just going to figure out the exposure for you. But for those of us who do like to have some control of it, and have that intuitive, quick adjustment of shutter speed and aperture, it's pretty nice. So, hope it wasn't too much of a ramble here. I just think it's a really cool feature of these Fuji X-Series cameras, and it's much more intuitive for someone who shoots a film camera. Thanks.